Thank you for coming. And I guess I want to talk about your very, very special approach, what I see as your very special approach to making movies. And because what I see is someone who goes very deep into character and atmosphere, and you let the places and the mannerisms and the gestures do a lot of the talking. It's a really unique experience. And I'm wondering if that sounds right to you. And then if you could address it on your own, from your own perspective.
I think that those things are like the byproduct of a process, and maybe in the category of style. But if I'm working on something, it never feels like, oh, I'm going to bust out some silences or, you know what would be nice here is just that little tick.
Yeah.
But there's always something happening in pretty much every moment, in every scene of everything I feel like I've ever worked on, long form, that is not being expressed or acknowledged. Something's being expressed inadvertently. You know, there's the scene, and then there's something happening underneath it.
Yeah.
And hopefully, if things are working, there's a dynamic that lets you clock both things at the same time. You know, how we're intentionally expressing ourselves and the thing that happens beneath the surface. And just personally, I find in interpersonal relationships and public relationship, you know, like a political campaign, how we're communicated to, that, you know, what is actually said and what is literally said is often at profound odds with what else is being communicated. And so I think just naturally working on a scene and getting into the edit and seeing what the actors are doing, it tends to make some kind of space to sensitize you to these things, and then I think you get what you're talking about.
Yeah, because it's, in one sense, it's the question of subtext and subtext, you know. But then in your films, I feel like that it runs much deeper than that, in the sense that you're so attentive to what we call the subtext that it winds up being it's often the focus of the scene.
Yes, I agree.
So I guess that begs the question, where do you begin with actors in your exploration of character? I mean, I'm sure that it's very different with every actor. I mean, I know you had, you have special relationships with different actors, but let's start with casting, for instance. Where does what is it that, for instance, to take a very specific example, sparked you with Philip Seymour Hoffman, with Capote?
Well, I think of all of the disciplines within filmmaking, casting is probably the most misunderstood and underappreciated discipline, you know, art form within itself. Because character, I think, is story. In the case of Phil, I had known him and we were friends. And when I first presented him with the script, he said, he read it and he said, hey, why don't you come over? And we went onto his balcony when he was living on Sheridan Square. And he was really turned on by the story, the character. But he said, right now I weigh 240 pounds and I'm like 5'10", something like that. And it just seems possibly ridiculous and reckless and I'm trying to think back to what the difference between me now and then is, because I don't think I would make a decision like that. It just seemed so out there, like taking a shot from half court. The hoops that he had to jump through to make that work physically and with his voice were so profound. But for example, the issue of being short, because he was more than half a foot taller than Truman Capote, and we would, say, well, what does that really matter? Why is his Capote's height important? It's really about the complex, how the complex might have contributed to who he was. And it's easy for me to cast very, very tall people, and put him around and to, wardrobe him in a way that might keep his shoulders tight so his head appears bigger, like a smaller person. But understanding the complexes and, the more we talked about it and the more naturally he just had his divining rod into who he was and what that struggle was all about, and how much, to be honest, he identified with him, and how much he identified with him at that moment in his career, that where Capote was in his life and where Phil was in his life, meaning both of these guys were recognized and appreciated as major talents, but had yet to land the big one. And the more you get into that conversation, the more the physical obstacles just become insignificant, and you say, well, that's my problem. We'll figure out a way to deal with that aspect of it. But once we're plugged into, the inner stuff, you feel a kind of confidence.
Yeah, it's interesting because it makes me, I'm thinking of a film by someone else, True Confessions, Bela Grossbard, where Robert De Niro and Robert Duvall play brothers. I mean, those two guys look like they're from different planets. But in the movie, it makes perfect sense. And it's because they're both on the same inner wavelength. Yeah.
It's amazing how much you will forgive if the behavior is truthful.
Or not look at. It just becomes beside the point, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to look at a different subject. You had said in an interview, I mean, all of the films that you've made are based on actual events. And you began in documentary, with a documentary. Well, you began with a documentary. I wonder about, I have the impression that the transition was really seamless for you, and I'm wondering for you what the dividing line is between documentary and fiction. I mean, on a personal level, not on.
Yeah. It really feels the same. Working on a documentary or working on a narrative feature, it fundamentally feels the same to me. And with The Cruise, which was my first film, I mean, it employs a lot of narrative techniques and, observes. It's not so much documentary as it is a documentary portrait. And I think all of my films have been portraits. And my narratives incorporate, documentary technique too. When you're actually looking through the eyepiece and through the lens of a camera as you're shooting a documentary, and there's that coincidence that occurs of a character unfolding and light and composition and whatever's happening in this, with the sound, there's a coincidence that happens that you could not fabricate. And it's electric, you know, it's magic, and you just know, you know, you're like, there's that feeling. And it should feel that way, I think, for me, it should feel that way too when you're working on a film. And as much preparation as you do.
On a fiction film.
On a fiction film, yeah. And as much preparation as you do, and as much as you might understand it or think you understand it, when you get there, if it's been preconceived too well, it doesn't work. And it's nice to mix it up and keep the actors on their heels and do whatever it takes to kind of get to that feeling, so that when it happens, you are shooting something that is happening and it's alive and it's not going to happen again, you know, ideally.
So when you say preconceived, I assume what you mean is scripted, storyboarded, everything, you know, locked down. What you're doing is just realizing a plan.
Yeah, I mean, so far for the style of, you know, the style that's been used in the films I've made so far, that's well, very much what they're about.
Yeah, yeah. You really, what it is you want to look for yourself to be surprised and for the actors to be surprising themselves.
I mean, I'm looking for the moment of discovery, you know, when something actually occurs for the first time, and it will only ever occur for the first time. So we might rehearse, but I tend not to rehearse to the point where we find it. I like to rehearse to the point where we're in the ballpark and expect that we're only going to get one proper take, more or less.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, do you find yourself confronted with situations where there are multiple takes that give you different, you know,
all the time,
a bounty?
All the time. Yeah.
Right.
No, I mean, that's why I'm saying that's the idea. How often does it happen like that?
Yeah.
You know, sometimes.
Yeah, because you also have the problem of actors who are good on the first take, acting with someone who's not good until they've warmed up a few times. I know that's a tough one.
Yes.
We're not going to be naming names. But what is the difference then between mining for truth when you're making a documentary or for that moment and doing it with a fiction film?
You're asking really hard questions, Kent.
I'm sorry, Bennett.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like, again, it's that feeling, you know, when something is being revealed. And in the case of Foxcatcher, which I imagine not many people have seen.
Yeah, actually, is there a show of hands that we could do? Has anyone seen Foxcatcher?
So we'll know what we can. Difficult to see it.
Oh, yeah. So we'll know what we can talk about and can't talk about.
One person. I'm going to direct this answer to you. If everybody could just cover their ears because there's spoilers. Well, in the case of Foxcatcher, should any of you choose to see it? This is a story, it's based on a true story of which everybody who was around that I reached out to pretty much was eager to participate and share. But pretty much everybody was guarding some aspect of the story, which is really intriguing when that happens. And over the course of years, I would keep going back to people and re-interviewing and find out, you know, what happened. And often it's just backstory. Yeah. It's to understand really what's going on in these characters, even if it's never made explicit. And there's a lot of curious things that happen in the story that it's hard to fathom, you know, even though they tell you, well, this happened, this happened, this happened, and we know that these are facts.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert. A very, very wealthy man got wrestlers to move onto his estate to train for the Olympics.
Yeah. It stays here.
Shh. And over time, he descended into a dangerous person,
Yeah.
and exhibited all sorts of signs of instability and even madness, and a love for guns of all type,
Big ones and small ones, yeah.
and drugs,
And wrestlers.
and wrestlers. And the question that came of why did you stay, and did you think you were in danger, or why, if he was like this, didn't you get this person help? And there was always this response, well, you don't understand. No, 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 no. It's not like that. Well, it's exactly like that. You know, like he was, you know, drug-addled, mentally ill person with an enormous arsenal, and he would do very funny things with his guns. And understanding, really, for these characters, for Mark Ruffalo and for Channing Tatum, like, how did things get to the point where you were doing this and accepting that and looking the other way and learning what that is? We sort of stick a pin in the scene. Like, we know this scene happened, we know this thing happened, and we would get there on the day, and we would work it. And usually we would discover something, and you go, oh, that's what that's like. Spoiler alert, there's some drugs done by Channing Tatum's character.
Yeah, don't do them at home.
And yeah, do not try that at home.
Don't do drugs.
With very wealthy people.
Yeah.
But there's this question of, like, how the hell does it get there? Like, you're training for the Olympics, and now you're flying around in a helicopter, and this guy offers you cocaine, and without much hesitation, you say sure, and that begins the whole thing. And this is who you think you are, and yet this is what you're doing, and how do you understand that? A lot of these things really are not understood until we're, like, in the process of doing it and exploring around, and when all of a sudden you were shooting in the helicopter and Steve Carell does something that surprises him, and it just makes sense. You know, you recognize it. You go, oh, that's what that was.
Yeah. When I think of Foxcatcher in particular, when I think of your films in general, and Foxcatcher in particular, I'm thinking of it's the pursuit of what is familiar yet strange. Is the way that it feels to me.
Yeah. Familiar yet strange. Yeah. I mean, this was a story, and I would say the same for Capote, and I'd say the same for Moneyball too.
Yeah.
That personally, I've got no identification with, like, the details of these stories. That I've never lived anything like these stories, and in particular, Foxcatcher. It just seems so I mean, it's really an absurdist story. Like, it has the foundation for an absurdist comedy.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the movie.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Spoiler. Yeah.
You're giving the whole thing away,
Yeah.
Ken.
Oh well.
It's
Well, good night, everybody.
An empty theater tomorrow.
Yeah.
Friday.
Yep.
Friday.
Yeah.
But you know, it's just a very weird situation. These wrestlers, you know, rich guy, and yet it just felt familiar.
Yeah.
And you know, something to do with just these themes of wealth and class and entitlement and people who have no business, embarking on a venture with each other, understanding for a moment, that they fit, like what is like the weird transaction, and it just feels kind of familiar to me. It feels kind of American to me.
Yeah, on every level, because it's also the tactility of that film. I mean, when I was in the film, what you have in all of Bennett's films is the meeting ground between people from very different kinds of worlds, just kind of coming together improbably, suddenly, just sort of thrown together. And so Channing Tatum's character, who just doesn't have two nickels to rub together and lives like in the kind of house that I remember from my childhood, and then arriving in the middle of this strange terrarium like existence that Steve Carell inhabits in the middle of right near Valley Forge, and and all of its associations with the American past. And then it's also you're looking at this wild recreation of 80s America, and I would imagine that it feels like that's something that really got you excited. The upholstery, the VHS tapes, and the strange homemade movies about Foxcatcher. I don't know. That stuff is all really comes alive.
It's, when something, yes, and the appeal of all of that stuff, for me was instantaneous. Like it really did happen in a big flash. I read a newspaper article that a stranger had handed me in a store, and said, "You're going to want to make a movie out of this story that happened." And I said, "Okay, just back off." And, a month later, I opened the envelope, and it all came crashing in very, very quickly. Like, oh my God, I'm going to do this. And the appeal of everything that you just described is really instantaneous, and something that you don't even want to think about too much. You just like, yep. How do I get the rights? How do I get the rights? But yes, the what's in a tracksuit, and then the upholstery of, and these horses, and these wrestlers, and these wrestling mats in the 80s, like denim jackets, and it's just like the whole soup of it.
Yeah, and also that weird Morning in America, Reagan era feeling. I mean, you're right back there. I without dwelling too much, giving away any more spoilers, but I do want to talk about a particular scene in the movie, which when you see it, is gonna, strike you immediately, and that's the first meeting between Channing Tatum and his brother, played by Mark Ruffalo, who are both wrestlers in the film, and Bob and Mark Schultz, and they're training together, sparring together, and the scene is just absolutely mesmerizing. I mean, those guys look like, it's not just that they look like real wrestlers, it's that it looks like they know every single move, and every single move translates into a kind of immediately you can feel the sibling dynamic between the two of them. That's an amazing way to introduce that.
These guys, these two actors, Channing and Mark Ruffalo, just really took it upon themselves to learn each other, these parts, the world, and they started training wrestling maybe 7 months out, and spending time with each other and spending time with the real people. And I don't know if I have words for this, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, I have such a feeling for these actors. Part of the reason why I like making films, and part of the reason why an event like this is not always the best idea, is because
It's working out fine so far.
I'm not. I live in filmmaking in that place where words do escape me.
Yeah.
You know,
it's just a question of immersion.
It's just a question of a different language.
Yeah.
It's just a different language, and I've never thought of myself as a very articulate person. And when we were sketching out the outline and drafting drafts of over years of this film,
Mm-hmm.
the first act saw many scenes that were designed simply to establish who these brothers were and who they were to each other, and what they wanted and what was in the way of them getting what they wanted, and what were they doing to overcome that, and what was their predicament, and to make explicit the dynamics between them, the reverence and the rivalry. And we shot the scene that you're describing, which is two brothers who are each other's wrestling partners, and they kind of warm each other up, and then they do light training. And in this case, it gets a little competitive, and they go live, and then it gets a little rough. And what you learn without words and how they do this allowed me to eliminate 20 minutes of scenes from the first act, because you just knew everything. You learned everything.
Yeah.
And it's
every gesture counts. Every movement counts.
It's the way that, you know, Mark Schultz, you know, Channing Tatum's character sort of repels everybody, and then when you see his brother Dave Schultz, played by Mark Ruffalo, when you see how he just breaks those barriers in his like warmth and affection, and he brings him in, just like cutting room floor, just eliminate. It just it does everything. I mean, it's in a gesture, and it's in a moment, and incredible performances, to my taste.
Yeah. And then a very different kind of performance from Steve Carell. What? I mean, the character of John E. for Eagle DuPont is just, casting. That's a whole other level of, having a casting problem, and so it's an incredible performance. And what brought you to Steve Carell?
I wonder if that's uninteresting to people who haven't seen it yet, but I'll just say.
Well, I think it's interesting in the sense that most people know Steve Carell primarily as a comic actor.
Yeah.
This is a very different kind of performance in many ways from anything he's ever done. So in that sense, it's interesting.
Spoiler alert. The character that he plays does some horrible things. And he does some unexpected things. And I wanted to cast somebody who would be unexpected but could pull it off. And it seemed like it needed to be somebody that defies our imagination of who this person can be. By the way, he disappears. I mean, you don't see Steve Carell in the role. He's just not there. But he said to me when we were first discussing this, he says, I've only ever played. Catherine Keener, have you found a seat? Thanks for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, Catherine Keener. But more importantly, Clyde Mulroney. Welcome. I'm going to go back to the beginning and cover everything for you. What was I saying?
So where were you born?
I don't talk about that. Thank you. So Steve Carell said that he's only ever played characters with mushy centers. And John DuPont does not have a mushy center, though he seems to for almost all of the film. But in truth, there's something very sharp and dangerous inside there. And I'll use the word dark.
It fits.
Yeah. And so the soft, mushy center part, the awkwardness, the uncomfortable in your own skin and all like that. Check, check, check. Yep. And this other bit, the darkness and the sharpness, the guy is a comedian, which is to say he's messed up. I'm joking. I mean, a little bit. If you talk to anybody, everybody will say the same thing. Oh, Steve Carell, he's the nicest guy. He's the greatest guy to work with. He's the best guy. He's such a great dad. He's such a great father. It's just, my kids go to school with his kids, and he's just such a great guy. And all of that's true. And he is the greatest guy to work with. And he is an incredibly benevolent soul. But I really do believe that part of being a comic means that there is an aspect of you that you just don't reveal to the world, like ever, if you can help it. Ultimately, it's hard to conceal who you are for a lifetime.
Darkness and comedy really do go hand in hand.
They go hand in hand. Don't have to look far for many, many examples, but in Carell's case, I don't think he ever had an aversion to going there, but I don't think there was ever an opportunity for him to demonstrate, his latitude as an actor. And from the beginning, he talked about this as something that was going to be different for him in every way. And the solemnity of the story that was really brought into stark relief by the presence of the family of the man he murdered on set, and the brother of the man he murdered, and dozens of people who were close to the story. I think only fortified his original commitment that this was not going to be a silly thing. And we're just going to play the movie for you right now.
Yeah, here we go.
I wish you all had seen it, but I hope you do.
The vagaries of scheduling. Somebody's applauding? Yeah. And I believe that Sony Pictures Classics will be opening this film when? What's the opening date? When? November 14th. There we go. So
can I just give a shout out to Michael Barker?
Yeah, there he is.
From Sony Classics. We did Capote together, and we're doing this film. And Michael and his partner over at Sony, Tom Bernard, have been doing this for 35 years. And last year they were honored at the American Museum of the Moving Image. It's so much easier to not talk about yourself.
Okay.
And before speeches and stuff were made, they had assembled a scroll of every film that these guys released. And I cried.
It's an honor roll. Yep.
I could not believe it, and it was. And another thing about Michael Barker, not many people know this, but when he was 9 years old, he saw Grand Illusion.
Well, when you were 9 years old, were you watching movies? Were you drawn to movies when you were very young?
Yeah, I was. And I definitely have moments in my life where I discovered a film and the language of the film itself spoke to me in a way where as if someone came up to you and started speaking a language you've never heard but you understood, and it was able to express things that the language you knew could not. And amongst these films were Pawnbroker, PBS when I was about 13 years old. I don't know why I was watching it, but Salesman by the Maisels came on.
Yes. It's quite a film.
Incredible. Both of these films. Maybe back to the whole quiet thing. In Salesman, I remember the way it opens up. I'd never seen a documentary like this. I'd never seen anything by the Maisels. I didn't know who they were or what I was looking at. But it begins with a Bible salesman. It's 1966, black and white, and we follow this guy like into a house. And having watched a lot of TV, there's just a natural sense, like an expectation about an explanation is coming. Either a voiceover or something was going to occur to explain what we were looking at.
Yeah.
And when that did not happen, I remember just leaning in and realizing that it wasn't going to explain it because it was all right there. But somehow in the film itself, you felt the presence, you felt the consciousness of the film. I felt like I was inside somebody's head. This is how I felt about Kubrick's films too. Remember seeing The Birds also when I was young and feeling that way too. I mean, part of what's so eerie about that film is the mind of that film itself. The way it doesn't tell a story, the way it observes the story, and what is this mind I'm trapped inside observing this thing? It's so disconcerting.
Well, the story kind of comes together in a very odd way. It's an extremely unorthodox piece of work, right? And also a film that has its own sense of quiet, right?
Yeah, and leaves you without conclusions.
Yeah, and I believe it was actually meant to end differently. And he reinvented the ending on the spot. That was the first time that he had done that in that movie. He invented a lot of stuff. Just, he showed up on the set and said, okay, this is no good. Threw it out and reworked it.
It's amazing. If as much as it is controlled and preconceived, that he'd still be on his feet like that.
Yeah. I think he was at a moment in his career when he was very worried about how what the public thought of him. He had made Psycho.
Yeah.
He wanted to, try and top it, and he wanted to try and be with it.
Right.
So Salesman, and which Kubrick films were?
I saw at a very early age, at too early of an age, by a lot. I saw 2001, and that was pretty searing. And watching somebody age in an accelerated way, and seeing themselves in a very confusing end, which made a lot more sense to me, has made less sense to me each time I've seen the film. But when I was like very young and saw it, it made perfect sense. I mean, I got the message. and wasn't happy about it. We had a copy of Clockwork Orange in our house, a VHS. Or I should say, we had all but the last 4 minutes.
Oh.
And
How did that work?
well, my brother, we had a VCR, and we also had a video camera with. We had a video camera, a separate video camera.
Yeah.
Back in those days, you had a Portapack.
Right.
And I guess my father must have rented that film, and my brother set up the camera on a tripod and pointed it at the television, and the tape, ran out, right before the end. And without exaggeration, I think I saw that film at least 100 times, at least in that crappy quality. And I never saw the end until I moved to New York and was playing at Cinema Village.
Yeah. Yeah. Which
and
is
boy, that changes things.
Yeah.
But I remember watching that film again and again and thinking that the place to be was behind the camera. Noticing the shots, noticing how he worked. When I was 15 years old, I had an English class that I would ultimately fail as a freshman in high school, taught by a fella by the name of Mr. O'Rourke. It was very nice, and I don't begrudge him for failing me.
Okay.
But he hatched some kind of a plan that we were going to have. We were all going to have walkabout projects. We were all going to go off on our own and figure out how to do something. And he got a 16 millimeter print of Walkabout by Nicholas Roeg, and he projected it in the theater. The stage theater we had at our high school, and I had the feeling, beginning around age 12 or 13, that making films is I was lucky enough to have the wherewithal to begin messing around with video cameras and Super 8, that this is, would be a great thing, but nobody I knew even knew anybody that had anything to do with this business.
Yeah.
And I thought, how far-fetched is that ambition? But then I thought, well, there are other 12-year-olds right now who one day will be making films, and what do they know that I don't know?
Right.
And maybe it's possible.
Yeah.
Probably not too far behind the curve. And then I saw Walkabout, and it blew me away, but B, it seemed technically fathomable. I watched that film, and there didn't seem to be anything in there that I didn't understand. There's no special effects. There's no crazy camera movement. It's utterly simple. It wasn't until I saw it again years later that I realized how impossibly sophisticated
I was going to say
photography is. But at least it seemed to me like, this guy just got a couple of actors and a camera and just schlepped around, and there's nothing to it. It seemed, from a technical perspective. And at 15 years old, I thought, I can understand, I could get there. There's nothing here that's too mysterious.
Yeah.
And interestingly, about 26 years later, moments before the world premiere of my first narrative feature, which was Capote at the Telluride Film Festival, less than 24 hours after the film was completed, where the final check print, came back okay. There was some kind of an award being given to Criterion Collection
Yes.
And as part of that, they projected, clips from the films that, were within the collection.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, that iconic image of that, Aboriginal, perched, backlit.
David Gopalil.
Yeah. Massive, on a massive screen. All of a sudden, just boom, that image from Walkabout. And, from whatever, 27 years prior, that thought was as if it was like 1 second ago of, oh, I think I could do this. I mean, it was like right as if no time. One of the most crazy cosmic coincidences of my life.
Kind of in keeping with Nicholas Roeg, too, with the way that his movies work.
Yeah.
Right? Because time is just collapses.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the distance between wanting to make movies and picking up the camera for the first time, was that a...
I think it started with making movies and then realizing, oh, this is something that would be great to continue doing.
Yeah.
There wasn't even a thankful that I didn't have the curse of wanting to do something before I started doing it.
Yeah.
It was just one of those automatics, like, oh my God, here's the camera.
Yeah. And right from the start, you've had a really unique fascination with illuminating kind of corners of American experience that really aren't touched in movies. They're very particular kinds of interactions, particular kinds of unease places. I'm wondering if you, I guess I'm wondering if that's something that's a conscious thing for you.
Can you be more specific?
I mean that, we had said before, and you had agreed to the idea that you're making movies about people crossing paths who are, coming from extremely different worlds, different viewpoints. But it's also, you're looking at very unusual slices of American life. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the world of Foxcatcher, and, the strange world of Foxcatcher. So that's sort of like, I guess my question is, what is it in American experience that really draws you?
Maybe it's, I don't disagree, but I think it's more just a natural consequence because, I'm an American and I live here. And, I guess I'm curious about examining stuff that doesn't get acknowledged. Just I was reading Milan Kundera, or as he pronounces it, Kundera. Who knew? As his essays on the art of the novel, and he talks about the novel being a unique art form, a unique medium with which discoveries can be made, illuminations can be made, and things can be expressed that are not possible through any other medium. And the novel being, what it is, and has as at its core the requisite of discovery. It needs to be, it's about finding something new. And what he says, these are kind of strong words, but any novel that does not manage to shine a light in a hitherto unknown place is immoral by the standards of what a novel is. And he tracks the history of the novel as one history, beginning with Cervantes.
Yes.
I don't think it's any different with film, or should be any different with film. There's a whole category of film that's not about that, and totally valid and legit. that's maybe more about entertainment and thrills and other things.
Mm-hmm.
But as a medium, it's, you know, it's the greatest medium in the history of art, you know, because it incorporates every other medium.
Mm-hmm.
And it can just do things, you know. It's the capabilities are just profound. And I get sent scripts, you know, and you know, I don't feel like a compulsion to like work and like, you know, start the, you know, next thing as the other thing's winding down.
Mm.
But I do want to work, you know, and I want to keep, you know, making films so long as, you know, so long as they let me. But if there isn't something that I'm getting at that I've never seen before that feels like a discovery to me too,
Mm-hmm.
It's just hard to get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
You know.
Yep.
And, you know, living in America, there's a hell of a lot to, you know, think about and look at, and you know, I get this feeling that people will look back years from now at this point in history the way we look back at points of history and say, you know, what the hell were they thinking? Like, how could this be? Like, what is that about?
Mm-hmm.
How could you not get it together? And how did this person come into power? And who backed that decision?
Mm-hmm.
You know, this the improbability. You know, in a time of such profound advancement in technology and science, and as we're understanding the world better and better, there is simultaneously a kind of decline happening, I think. And a big part of it is cultural. And for me, it's the moment I live with a story long enough, it always ends up, you know, I always end up kind of like looking away from, you know, the spectacular thing and kind of over here, and like what's going on in that corner, because that has more to do with like what's going to happen. And really not like a thought out strategy, not like a decision, not a determination, but not wanting to get caught up in the polemics, you know, in the politics or even taking sides or making a conclusion, but to try to look past the conflict to the core and down to the human level of what is contributing to this dynamic where madness happens, you know, where tragedy can come from. In the case of Foxcatcher, and not ultimately conclude he was bad, he was, you know, good guy, bad guy, or anything like that, but rather just try to be unflinching about it and keep looking past.
Yeah. We just got the high five, but that's a perfect place to end. And I really thank you, Bennett. It's been great.
Thank you so much, Kent.
Thanks.